Hey guys, welcome to Writing Action and Adventure on WordCamp. This is a free and public class where we are going to break down different subgenres of adventure novels and talk about different techniques in putting these stories together. Everything from designing a cast and choosing objectives for your characters and making sure that we're putting the best possible objectives in those characters' ways, and that we are writing action scenes, focusing on the things that books do best, not writing them exactly the way that we would write a movie action scene. And all these things. So we're going to be having a chock-full presentation today, so we're just going to jump right in. So what is WordCamp? We are a community that is focused on helping you take your concept from idea to first draft to polished manuscript with lots of free classes, events, and workshops like this one that you're in right now. So whether you're watching on Discord or one of our other streaming sites like YouTube or Twitch, you can leave your comments in the chat, and I'll try to get to them as they come in. It sometimes takes a minute for them to show up from the other sites, but come by Discord and join us if you'd like to interact the best. If you come on to join our Discord server, then you can unmute and speak on the mic when we have time for questions, comments, or other types of interaction. We have some paid classes, like our VIP member classes, boot camps, and the Writer's Lab, and we have a lot of these free one-off events as well. ScriptCamp is a nonprofit organization that brings free and low-cost classes to help you reach your life goals. We have lots of different Discord servers, as you can see here, that are focused on different arenas of learning. ScriptCamp is our first and biggest and most popular. That is focused all on screenwriting for movies and TV and has boot camps for writing an entire pilot in 6 weeks, writing an entire feature in 8 weeks. These are starting soon. New sessions of these are in the process of starting now. So definitely come by ScriptCamp if you'd like to learn to write those different formats. We have weekly classes in CodeCamp and TuneCamp as well for computer coding, programming languages, and also TuneCamp for animation. And we have, starting soon, Novel Bootcamp starting next week. That's on the 25th of February, Saturdays from 12 to 2 Pacific time. We're going to take you all the way through writing an entire novel from beginning to end. So here's the stuff coming up. These are the free classes. We have a query letter class that is on Thursday the 23rd, where we're going to look at not only some successful query letters that have worked, but using the query letter format as a way to plan or design your story beforehand. That new session of Novel Bootcamp is on the 25th, and we have an outlining class on March 8th at 6 o'clock, where you will learn how to figure out what happens in your novel story before you begin. We also have a Best Protagonist class over on ScriptCamp on Wednesday the 22nd. And that new session of Pilot Bootcamp starts on March 5th. That's going to be running Sundays from 11 to 1.
Could you tell me how much it cost, the bootcamp?
So if you join ScriptCamp and you become a member, then you get access to everything we do. If you get an unlimited subscription, that's $49 a month. If you buy it just monthly, if you get yearly subscription, that goes down to $29 a month, which is 40% off.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So, Unlimited will include access to absolutely everything that we do here, over 100 hours of content per month. We've got exclusive chat channels. We've got a video library with recordings of all our previous classes, not just the public ones. Comes with $100 off of consultations and proofreads. And you get these things called script coins, which you can use on things like a table read of your work and other various prizes and activities. This will include every single thing that we do. So check out Unlimited if you are interested at all in these many different servers. It's not just ScriptCamp. It will include WordCamp. It includes CodeCamp. It includes TuneCamp. It includes absolutely everything. This comes also with a 2-week free trial, so you can try it out for 2 weeks and cancel anytime. Okay. Let's look at this page really quick. So yeah, if you want to join us, become that supporting member, and get access to all boot camps and labs from just $29 a month, head to scriptcamp.net/membership. You can also volunteer if you know a skill or language that you might like to teach. We're looking to fill out these other servers with lots of classes, so definitely send a message to me or Nacho if you think that you have some skills that you'd like to offer. And you can refer your friends. If you refer somebody as a member and they continue past their free trial, you will both get a free month of subscription and a free month of Arc Studio Pro. Okay, here's an overview of the Novel Bootcamp course coming up. I'm not going to go over every single thing in here right now, but you can at least take a look. Our first class coming up on the 25th is an overview of how to write a book in 12 weeks and kind of looking at these basic essentials of point of view, genre, things like this, where we're kind of trying to figure out what the different kinds of books are and what kind of book that you would like to write. You, of course, should be reading all the time. If you'd like to write a book, there's no way to write well unless you are reading a lot. So every week we're going to ask, what have you read lately? Tell us about the most recent chapters or books that you read. We're going to start with things like prose and premise and move into loglines and queries. So we're going to use those loglines to help guide the construction of the story. We're going to build out a cast of characters in the world and try to organize a roadmap through the story with a set of scene cards, which is a full paragraph for every chapter, in at least every chapter, a full paragraph for every chapter in your entire book. Starting pages by April 15th, you will then work through that book, writing 10 to 15,000 words a week and finishing by May 27th. So, lots of work, high work, high reward. By the end, you will have a book. Will it be a masterpiece? Probably not, but you will have completed a book, and that's always, we say, one of the most essential skills to doing this is that skill of finishing things and moving on. So if nothing else, these boot camps are designed to help teach you your own methods of organization, or we offer you this method of organization, but some things might work from it and some things might not for you. So you have to figure out what will work for you and what will get you finished book after finished book. You'll have to write a lot of them to get to the point where you're doing quite well with them, but this is trying to put you on that path to becoming a professional writer. So here's a list of all the recurring and upcoming stuff. I've mentioned a few of these already, and you can see all the different clubs and weekly activities on the right here. We have everything from animation workshops to genre-focused groups like horror and fantasy. We have special groups like disability and screenwriting, disabled writers group, queer writers group, and women's writers groups that all meet at different times at least once a week. We have 2 different script swaps every week, and we have table reads Sundays at 2 o'clock. If you're interested in an adventure, you might also be interested in fantasy. That is a genre group that meets Sundays at 5 on ScriptCamp. Okay, so I don't even have an overview for everything in this class because there were so many things I kept throwing in up to the very last minute. It was impossible to make an actual table of contents. So I think I'm just going to be picking the stuff that I find the most interesting to focus on and trying to hit the stuff that we haven't covered before in a ScriptCamp class. I want to avoid saying the same things again and again and reiterating everything I've said in the action class, which is not to say that there aren't some slides in here that are adapted from our previous action classes, but I wanted to really skew this towards prose fiction and novels as much as possible. So there are always going to be these differences between, there are always going to be similarities between types of writing, between screenplays and books. And especially in action adventure, there's a lot of crossover because these two forms of writing have really similar appeals in both book and movie form. But there are also really distinct things that we should keep in mind and stuff that you can do in one that you can't do in the other, or that you do very differently between one and the other. So let's get into it. Without an overview, we're just going to dive into writing adventure books. So let's start with what is an adventure story, and we're going to abridge this definition from Don Damas's Introduction to the Encyclopedia of Adventure Fiction. He says, an adventure is an event or series of events that happens outside the course of a protagonist's ordinary life, accompanied by danger and physical action. Adventure stories almost always move quickly, and the pace of the plot is at least as important as characterization, setting, and other elements of the creative work. So this definition gives us that the adventure is outside of your character's normal life. But I think what that really is saying is that even if your character has adventures all the time, then this one is an elevated and sort of higher stakes, more important adventure than normal. If we look at something like think of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, right? Jack Sparrow has had tons of adventures, and if we focused on him as the lead character, we do in the later movies, but for the first movie, our lead character or our POV character is Will, so it feels a lot more like a classic adventure story because it's someone having to step up out of their normal experience in order to go on this next adventure. But there are lots of stories also where the character is having adventures constantly, but we sort of have to have a reason why we're focusing on this one in particular, or why we're starting with this one. And almost always the reason is this one is particularly impactful or dangerous or important, or it represents a kind of point of critical development for that hero in some way. Like Han Solo has had tons of adventures, as we know, but A New Hope is the story where he learns to say, I don't care about the money, I care more about my friends or other people. It's the journey of him coming to care about other people. Remember, he swoops back in the Millennium Falcon at the end, and even though he said, I was just in it for the money and then I'm out, well, he came to care about Luke and Leia, and that's why we're really watching this adventure. Every other adventure that he had, he didn't really learn that same sort of stuff. I know there was a prequel movie with him, and he kind of a little bit had a different journey there. But you see what I mean, that if your character's having adventures all the time, there's a reason why you've started with this one, or why you've highlighted this one, and why this one is just more important than the others. So that's just kind of the basics here. So we have a series of events and obstacles with physical challenges that your character needs to overcome. Violence is an essential part of action, and adventure doesn't necessarily need to, like, there's a ton of crossover between what we say action and adventure. Action is going to be more based on interpersonal conflict and violence between intelligent entities, so whether that's people versus people, usually. Could be people versus aliens or versus robots or stuff like that as well. Adventure does involve peril and high stakes and life or death physical feats and situations. It doesn't necessarily need to revolve around that interpersonal violence and conflict the way that action does. A lot of the time it will, but it doesn't absolutely have to. You could have an adventure story, for instance, where a character is just trying to hike through the wilderness, and the things that they're encountering are, they're starving, and they get attacked by a bear, they need to cross a chasm, they fall and they break their leg. Like, all of that could be parts of an adventure as well. If it's an action adventure, maybe we'd say, your character is fighting off a pack of dangerous wolves and robbers and bandits that are chasing them across the wilderness. So you see how there's a lot of crossover between these things. So a lot of people say the first kind of adventure book is Robinson Crusoe, and this is from the early 1700s. This is not even the whole title. I think the whole title is much longer than this, but this is our classic guy gets stranded on an island and needs to make a go of it and, survive and make the best of it type story. I think we see adventure fiction in general going back thousands of years before this, in everything from epic poetry like the Odyssey and Beowulf. We see a lot of adventures in early forms of storytelling, both in campfire kind of traditions of, these tales of mythological heroes like Hercules or Odysseus, and then in just our stories of real life sort of adventures of, for instance, war heroes. Every war hero has kind of an adventure story attached to their life in a way, or westerns often have these elements of adventure as well. It overlaps with we're hearing some sound from somebody's mic. Make sure to keep your mics muted. If you guys don't mind, click that small gray microphone icon in the bottom left corner of the screen, if you don't mind. Okay, so there's lots of crossover. Most notably, there's going to be crossover with war stories, because war kind of inherently involves going on an adventure. That we have sea stories, which are not a common genre anymore, but used to be when people relied on the ocean much more to get around and for trade and for their daily life. Crime novels sometimes have elements of adventure too. Spy stories a lot of the time. I mean, James Bond is usually going to be globe-trotting adventure type stories. Science fiction, lots of sci-fi adventures, fantasy adventures, and westerns will usually have a lot of elements of this too. Some of our biggest subgenres that we're going to look at and focus on today are high fantasy. We're not going to focus on these, but I just want to mention that this is a thing. True stories and contemporary, just, memoirs and accounts of people's lives can definitely have an adventure kind of element to them, especially if that person is something like an explorer or a sailor or a pilot or a scientist who goes to remote locations or something like that. Real people's lives can definitely be told as adventure stories. We also have things like pulp adventure, sometimes called two-fisted tales, that we'll talk about a little bit later today. Swashbucklers, space opera often has adventure elements. We have Eastern genres like wuxia or xianxia, which are Chinese-focused genres that are basically fantasy adventures with martial arts, and using martial arts as a form of magic, essentially. I'm sure you guys can think of more types of adventure stories that we haven't even mentioned here, but I think that adventure is such a broad category, then we can look at it both as a plot in and of itself, but also just as like a style of storytelling. When we're talking about action, and like I said, there's so much crossover, then we're definitely looking for a lot of the same things. For either for action or adventure, we want clear and high stakes with a unique threat and some kind of fun way to combat it. And most often, the hook of an action adventure type story is going to be either the threat or the way that we're combating it, or the sort of journey that we need to go on to combat it. So we're going to defining the walls of these stories is not always as important as it would be in a thriller, for instance. Like in an adventure, it might be a pretty long journey or series of different journeys. We expect a little bit bigger of a scope in action-adventure stories. We would also maybe expect some measure of shifting fronts, like a conflict that's broken up into smaller bouts and skirmishes. Because if we look at the broad umbrella of a larger quest, something like you need to take this small magic ring to the other side of the world and throw it into a volcano, that's kind of your high-level quest. But within that, you have lots and lots of little quests and smaller objectives that you need to accomplish to get there. So we'll talk more about objectives and putting these kind of quest objectives or obstacles in your character's way. Action-adventure premises will also just support awesome set pieces. So they should be in worlds and featuring characters and types of action that just lead or lend themselves to big, over-the-top feats of physical action and violence. That's just stuff that is fun about this genre. We like characters that are very competent or are at least able to survive, because if your character dies a couple scenes in, obviously they're not going to be able to go on the full adventure, are they? A tangible and concrete goalpost is really key for action-adventure stories. On a set-piece basis, it's helpful to also have that really clear goal. Like let's think of just these sequences from something like Tintin, right? Where in Tintin, it'll be like, you got to get that briefcase from that guy. And that guy is running through the alleyways, and suddenly a flood hits the town, and now you're trying to get the same. It's like increasing the danger and difficulty of this challenge because a ticking clock has been introduced and the water level is now rising, and now the bad guy gets into a plane, so now we're chasing him through the air, but we're still trying to get the briefcase. Like, you see how having that clear objective is really important, and if we don't know what's going on or what your character's trying to do, it's actually really difficult to stay invested in extended action scenes. Stunts, explosions, shootouts, fights, chases, daring escapes, thrilling heroics, that's all the stuff that we are looking for. And in terms of intrigue, I mentioned, I just a second ago mentioned clear and tangible goals. We can't really get away with we don't know who the bad guys are and what they're doing for too long. Because the longer that we spend trying to even figure that out, the less time we're going to actually spend being able to combat or escape from those enemies in cool scenes. If we're trying to spend most of the story figuring out who the bad guys even are or what they're doing, it might be more of a mystery than an adventure. And last, we're looking for, ideally, some kind of originality or something we haven't seen lately or as often, something new yet familiar, and we can always harken back to these older stories, like we're going to talk about Pulp today, which is almost all looking back to the past as inspiration, and these sort of two-fisted tales that are, we could say, modernizations of these old serial-style storytelling of things like The Shadow or Doc Savage or things like that. Comic books all, are always rebooting these old heroes and these old characters that we have seen many, many times in the past. So you can take these characters as inspiration and you can find new ways to rework or reimagine these old things, but we're looking for something new. It doesn't have to be a ton, but something a little bit original would be nice. So, action-adventure protagonists, they're either competent or they will become competent by the end of the story. If that's not the case, they probably should not be your hero. While it's not unusual to have your hero start, like, you can have the hero start strong and remain that way, you absolutely can. In the case of these sort of more elemental characters, especially like Rambo or James Bond, within a given story, they still have that emotional arc, such as something they learn within that story, or are forced to maybe unlearn, no matter how small it is. Like, we could say, the Daniel Craig arc of the James Bond movies, is essentially watching James fall in love and then get his heart broken so badly that he becomes the version of the character that we understand in the rest of the series. So his arc with Vesper is kind of at the heart of what makes that quadrilogy, quintology of films actually work. So the way that they're competent might also change. If we start with a character like Ripley in Alien, then she starts as a competent sort of space traveler trucker, but by the end of the movie, she is an accomplished alien killer in a way, in that she's the only person that has killed a xenomorph that we know of. So by the time the second one starts, she actually has become competent in a whole new way, and now she's almost an expert on xenomorphs, or as far as the characters are concerned. She knows the most about them, and she becomes almost like the most competent of all the people there. Edge of Tomorrow is another... We're talking movies still, and I do want to talk books mostly, but we're looking at movies just because most people have seen these things. Edge of Tomorrow is a great example of how you can start a story with a character very incompetent, or who exemplifies the opposite of all the traits that we might want. And then we have him becoming super competent by the end of that story. I need to just answer a important phone call really quick. I hate to do this. I'll be right back in like 30 seconds. Sorry, guys. Hey, Justin. Sorry. Are you there? Hey, I'm here. I only have a second, but he's a contractor, but he's a playtester of books. What exactly? Thursday, please. I really like seafood. That was awesome. I played in the arcades, the old Disney show size $1 million, and I have it in my wish list to have it like because it's a really cool game. I played with it. Oh god, I love Spec Book. That was so good. Some sequence infuriating, but I think I'm really good. Oh yeah, for sure. The Spec Book one. Hey guys, so sorry about that. Super important phone call. I did not think it'd be coming in right now. Okay, hopefully we're all still here. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that, guys. Let me just make sure everything is still running. We're all still here, right? Okay, good. Let's get back to it. Where were we? On action protagonists. Everyone's still here, right? Can you guys still hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody's here.
Cool. So sorry about that. I have not had to do that before. All right. So protagonists. So the way that they are competent might change, or like the area of specialty they have might change, or they may have to realize that their version of competence before no longer applies, or that they have to become strong in some new way that they never thought they would have to. So it's super important that we be on board for your character's kind of mission or their overall goal. And the more sort of extreme or heinous things that your character is doing to accomplish their goal, the more difficult it will become to root for them. There's this fragile point of diminishing returns with particularly ruthless heroes, but if you play your cards right, people can actually still cheer for characters like, the Punisher or the guy, what's his name, Liam Neeson from Taken. You really just have to earn it and make sure that let's ask this question. How do we root for a character in an action or adventure story that does terrible things to succeed?
They are using these terrible things to combat their their opponent.
Mm-hmm. But why
Like,
do we root for that though?
well, because they're the protagonist. I don't think. Okay, if you use Taken as an example, he says, "I have a special set of skills." Blah 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 blah. Well, he's been. I forgot what his job was before, but he's I guess maybe been an assassin or something like that. So he's had to do terrible things to achieve the goal. So then his daughter is taken and sold into to human trafficking, and to get her back he has to do really terrible things to the opponents. So we're rooting for him in this case because he's the victim. In this case his daughter has been taken, she's a victim. So, and he's the hero. He's not a white knight. He's an anti-hero, but he's still the hero of our story, because he's going to rescue his daughter. And even if there wasn't the daughter, if something else happened, like maybe, I don't know, they broke into his house and killed his dog or whatever, John Wick, he or stole money from him, he's still the one to whom the action is being done. So he's the protagonist.
Okay, so I think what you're getting at is that the bad guys are worse. So
yes, the bad guys are worse. Yes, exactly. The bad guys
right.
are worse. Or even if their actions or their techniques aren't worse, okay, they're worse because they're the ones who did the bad thing initially.
Mm-hmm. Right. So yes, that is really really true. If your character's going to do terrible things, then we have to believe either they're doing it for a reason that we can get behind, and something that we can relate to and understand. And also, you can just make the bad guys so much worse that we believe that they deserve it. They deserve to have these techniques used on them because maybe they're the only things that would possibly work, or maybe they deserve to be punished this badly, or something like that. So yeah, if when you're writing action adventure, you can get as dark as you want. There's really no limit on how dark you can make this, except the point where you will lose the audience is when they feel that either A, your hero has gone too far in that they're now punishing, for instance, people that were not involved or that don't deserve to have been punished in this way, for whatever terrible thing has occurred. Or maybe your hero is using tactics that are disproportionate. For instance, I don't know, if your story is about your character's trying to recover a stolen, their prize family jewels from a family of goblins that stole it, and then your hero goes in and kills all of them and, nails them to the wall, then we're going to be like, I think that your hero was actually the bad guy here. I feel for the goblins more now than the hero. So you gotta watch out for that. Make sure that you're not crossing that horizon, or if you are crossing that line, you're doing it on purpose because you want your hero to turn into a villain, and that is fine too. But it breaks certain genres, so you can't really do that without changing the genre sometimes. And we'll talk a little. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say that kind of reminds me of Starship Troopers. I never read the novel, but my ex-husband dragged me to the movie, and he couldn't understand why I felt for the bugs. And I said, because in this supposed future, we invade their planet. Mm-hmm. We just think of them as just giant bugs, and so they're useless to us. They're meaningless. We think of them as just giant ants or giant spiders, and so they have no value. And this is why they send an asteroid to the planet and do a lot of damage. And he still couldn't understand that. And I'm like, okay, fine, let's just watch the movie.
Yeah, it's an alien invasion story in which we are the alien invaders, which is rare. Exactly. It's rare to see that because you see why. I mean, well, that Starship Troopers is a satire, and so it's deliberately doing this. But you can see how in a lot of stories, making your heroes the bad guys makes us just not want to root for them in the same way. So you got to be careful with that. Got to be aware of whose side the audience is really on. Let's look at some different subgenres of adventure fiction, especially looking at books and short stories and the history behind them, and figure out these different rules and expectations that they're going to come with. Let's start with Swashbuckler. This is a fun one. So, what's a swashbuckler? So this comes from a combination of adventure, historical fiction, and romance genres, combined with this very simplified and stylized moral outlook and world, usually. So this is going to be, really, really bad, clearly evil bad guys, really, morally correct good guys who are trying to take down the evil bad guys, though they might have a kind of chaotic, kind of Robin Hood is like a classic swashbuckler archetype character, right? Or Zorro is another of these kind of chaotic good characters that they might do kind of dastardly-ish things that's never too bad, but they're working outside the law. Batman is another sort of like similar kind of Zorro-type character. I think Batman was originally inspired by Zorro. But a swashbuckler is almost always set in the past, or some remote date in the past, like the Middle Ages, or what is called here the Cavalier years. I believe that would be referring to sort of the Three Musketeers era. I could be wrong on that, but in any case, generally these are either European or heavily European-inspired settings, but you can have a swashbuckler set anywhere. And they're almost always going to involve lots of melee combat between weapon-wielding characters, your main character being competent in the use of weapons and using those skills, as well as things like their acrobatics and their charm and their wit to solve problems and take down the bad guys. So the hero is often this gentleman adventurer, if not in rank themselves. They may not be a rich person, but in ethos they are a gentleman adventurer. It's characters with, a lot of principles or a strict moral code, but still in this world of very black and white morality, with this whole world on the kind of sliding scale of idealism to cynicism, tilting towards that idealistic side where your hero, although they might dress in all black, they still ultimately think that they, by doing the right thing, you will make the world a better place. And we often have these characters have sneaky, underhanded tactics that they'll have to use to succeed, but we kind of root for those charming rogues and thieves and stuff like that. High fantasy. Well, there's the occasion. So high fantasy is a couple things. One, it's a setting. So there might be a non-adventure story set in a high fantasy world. Like Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree is a recent example of, it's like a high fantasy setting about an orc that starts a pub. And it's like just about the challenges of starting a tavern, essentially. It's like a slice of life fantasy in a high fantasy world. So high fantasy is just a type of setting, but it's also a genre. So when we talk about the genre, there are these certain conventions and things that will be consistent. Behind me, we have the Dragonlance books, which are, I believe, adapted from the author's very early D&D campaigns. So this is going to think in terms of, this is the Tolkien genre of fantasy and adventure. So everything from your Lord of the Rings to your D&D. We have a setting that's usually going to be a world other than our own, which is called a secondary world. It might have some connection with a present-day Earth or some future or past version of Earth. For instance, the world of Conan, a lot of people don't realize, is set on Earth in the long-forgotten past, when the arrangement of the continents is very slightly different. But, for instance, Conan is from, like, modern-day Morocco kind of region. The Samaria region is in North Africa. So, yeah, this is actually the map of Earth, but that has been reimagined in this fantastical context. Magic and fantastical elements are often really brought to the forefront in this, and they tend to play a major role in the story's world building and conflicts. Now, in high fantasy as opposed to low fantasy, magic is more common and is more accepted and used and visible within the world. That's not strictly a crucial element, like you can do high fantasy with more subdued or minimal magic, or low fantasy with more of it, but high fantasy is distinguished by typically portraying its fantastical elements in this more positive and glamorous and public way, which is unlike these sort of horrible monsters and shifty sorcerers and the great power at great price kind of magic that's found in more low and heroic fantasy. Like in low fantasy, if a character is a wizard, it's usually because they had to sell their soul to the devil to get those powers, as opposed to high fantasy, where it might be like, well, every 8th kid is born with magic powers. Or it could be like in Xanth, the Xanth series by Piers Anthony, in which every single person is born with a different magic power. There's nothing sinister about it at all. Some of them can be used for destructive purposes, some of them can be used to heal or help people, some of them are completely useless, but magic isn't considered this bad, scary, hidden thing. It's part of the natural fabric of the world. Scale. It's often epic. High fantasy is epic scale, so power, politics, wars, the death of nations, gods and giants and dragons walking the earth, and the real threat of the end of the world, which comes up all the time in high fantasy. There can also be perhaps more lower stakes or personal stories set in high fantasy worlds, but in the capital H, capital F high fantasy genre, our scale must be epic. The consequences and repercussions of these quests and these actions that your characters are taking are going to affect thousands or millions of people and perhaps change the nature of the world itself. In terms of morality, the good guys are good and the bad guys are bad in high fantasy, with fairly minimal overlap. Even in cases where there is that moral ambiguity or flexibility, there's still a fairly clear divide between good and evil. And we might think of, like, Gollum, for instance. And, like, Gollum is a pretty conflicted character, but we can tell when he's in good mode versus when he's in evil mode. Like, he even switches, like, he changes his personality to evil version versus good version. So while that character does have the potential for both in him, we're never, like, it's never both in one, all at once. Or, like, Boromir is another great example, where Boromir gets corrupted by the ring, but it's only because of that he tilts towards doing truly evil stuff. Or Denethor is another example of, like, no, he's the madness is what's making him evil. It's not like Aragorn occasionally does something terrible in order for the greater good. That just doesn't happen in Lord of the Rings. Because in high fantasy, it's not like in a low fantasy version of this, Frodo might have to do something awful, or Frodo might have to kill Sam halfway through the story, or something like that, right? Where it's like, no, of course that would never happen in Lord of the Rings. The character, like, good is good and evil is evil, and while characters can move from one to the other, we always can see that happening. And it's never that we don't understand what good or evil are anymore, or it's never that those concepts prove themselves to be irrelevant, like in something like First Law, where like good and evil are completely like not, they don't even factor into the equation. Everyone is this shade of gray. Everyone is selfish. Everyone is trying to accomplish their own goals. And some characters are trying to just do truly terrible things for their own gain, even if they are kind of our point of view heroes. So good and evil might actually.
What's the name of that example?
Go ahead.
What's the name of that example you just gave?
First Law.
Gray area? First Law. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the one we in our novel boot camp we read the first few paragraphs. Remember the old man walking down the stairs? That was Glocta from First Law.
What is POV? I think of that as point of view. What is POV in your
right.
context?
You're correct. Point of view POV stands for point of view. So in books we have point of view characters, meaning that we're going to be, as we jump around the world, we're going to be experiencing that chapter through that character's eyes, right? So we have chapters that are following Frodo. We have some chapters that are following Aragorn and the Fellowship. We have some chapters that are following Merry and Pippin. So we have lots of different viewpoint characters in Lord of the Rings, or Game of Thrones is another example where there's just tons of different viewpoint characters. So that's what POV is referring to. Who is the story focusing on, and who is sort of taking control of the story in those moments? Good and evil might actually be tangible concepts in the world of high fantasy as well, in which you have things like there's a spell that detects good or evil. So it's not just an opinion, it's an objective force within the world. Or characters might dig deep enough and find a river of evil bubbling through the ground, like it's a physical force. And, you know, that is not always the case, and it leads to a lot of questions sometimes, like, are some races just born evil? A lot of high fantasy claims yes, which is kind of a problematic element of fantasy and sci-fi a lot of the time, is that it does sort of purport, those aliens, they're just bad. Or these orcs, those green dudes, all evil. Are there any good orcs in Lord of the Rings? No, not even one. Not even one. Tolkien, in some of his extended writings, does suggest it's possible that good orcs or redeemed orcs could exist, but do we ever see them in the series? No. And in fact, in the video games, the Shadow of Mordor video game series, we come to really even appreciate, like, it does a lot of work to build out the orc culture and show that they have distinct customs and language and the way that they interact with each other and all these things, but does it ever suggest that they aren't evil? No, not even once. So that's kind of, or I haven't played all of Shadow of War. Maybe it does eventually suggest there's a non-evil orc. But for the most part, it wouldn't be as fun if we were slaughtering all these monsters if we suggested, maybe they have some good in their hearts somewhere. So it's just part of the fun of this style of storytelling, that good is good and evil is evil. And in terms of evil, we also even have this kind of great evil. It's an enemy which is near evil incarnate. Remember Time Bandits? Don't touch it, it's evil. Or what about Sauron, or any of these we have these Dark Lord figures and things like Wheel of Time. They might be so, or even if it isn't an incarnation of evil itself, this character might just be so abhorrent, and their machinations and plots are just going to serve as the basis of the conflict. Their victory in any case would mean a terrible thing for everyone else. This is in contrast to low fantasy, which tends to favor those human versus human conflicts, and those, like, your villain's goal might not be, I'm going to take over the world and enslave all of humanity. It might be something like, I need to get revenge on this family, or I need to, steal this thing, or something like that. So yeah, low and heroic fantasy, which are more similar, more on the opposite end of the spectrum of high fantasy, are going to pit the heroes against mostly human and beast-like foes, not necessarily against a dark god that has returned from the afterlife. So in terms of your characters winning, victory is not really achieved through just force of arms alone in high fantasy. The most distinguishing feature of this from Sword and Sorcery is that you're not just winning through we found the way to fight and kill the bad guys. There's a lot of different strategies and, like, tactics and things that we have to do to ultimately win in a high fantasy story. It's not going to be just through logistics and political and military conflicts, which is the case in low fantasy. Imagine, for instance, a story in which, oh no, we just have to organize and train our troops properly, and then we can kill all the orcs and save Middle-earth. That's not the case in Lord of the Rings. Like, we can't succeed unless we throw this ring into this volcano. And any of that kind of logistical warfare stuff is just a delaying tactic to hopefully hold off Sauron's forces from taking over before Frodo succeeds at his part of the journey. So it's going to be a bunch of a large group of characters overcoming a variety of challenges of different scales and scopes, all against great odds. Very rarely do the good guys lose in high fantasy, or else it might enter this world of kind of grimdark, which is its own sort of separate world. Grimdark is a kind of broad term that has if you ask different people, it means different things, but generally is referring to the tone of the world, where it's like there is no good or evil, or maybe evil wins, or maybe evil has a huge advantage, or maybe everyone's evil, and people are punished ultimately for making the right choices and doing the right things. And if you make those right choices, you'll get screwed over as a result of those things. So that's kind of what grimdark often means. It means, like I said, it's kind of a lot of stuff. So that's high fantasy. I realize we're moving kind of quickly through a lot of this because we have so much to cover, but you can see that this is just that model created by Tolkien that a lot of people just have this is what adventure means to them. When you say the word adventure, a lot of people will think D&D style quest fantasy, and that's okay. That is largely accurate. And we just have to read and watch a lot of these things to understand and learn the rules and the expectations and the things that have been done, because that is one of these big caveats when it comes to this genre, is that a lot of stuff has been redone again and again, because I think as fantasy was finding its feet in the post-Tolkien years, a lot of people were like, well, we don't know what this looks like, but we know it looks like that. So there were a lot of Tolkien clones in the aftermath of Lord of the Rings as the genre was sort of coming into its own. Let's look at pulp a little bit. So pulp was a style of writing that emerged in the 1920s, or early teens and 1920s, featuring a variety of colorful, violent, and often male-oriented stories that were printed on this cheap paper, and that focused on what we call more lurid thrills, and that would be, characters like having violent battles with the bad guys and beating and overcoming them. There was probably a lot of rescuing women from situations where they were kidnapped and just happened to be in a bikini or things like this. I think we've seen a lot of covers of magazines from this, men's adventure magazines from this era that feature some strapping dude swinging on a rope through a window, and inside there's a bunch of Nazis that have some lady in a bikini tied to a chair or whatever. So I think we all know what that kind of looks like, and of course that comes with its own sort of its own problematic set of tropes and expectations from the past. But we don't have to take those. We can just take the parts of this that are fun and the parts of this that really work. So pulp content ranged from over-the-top action of stories like Doc Savage, to these heroic fantasy stories like Sword and Sorcery stories like Conan the Barbarian. This pulp era died down by the late 50s when that leading distributor of pulp, which was called the American News Company, went bankrupt. Although there was a resurgence in the 60s and 70s, mostly in the form of these edgy men's adventure magazines that all pretty much look like this on the left. And on the front, they're going to be making certain promises, and what promises are we making with these covers, would you guys say? What are we saying is going to be in these books?
Lots of the hero killing the opponent.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Hero fighting and killing the bad guys. What else?
And rescuing the damsel in distress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rescuing the damsel if there is one. There often is. Go ahead.
And lots of probably lots of battles that either culminate in either the large battle in the end, or achieving the goal, or maybe going to achieve the goal and having a large battle at the end to achieve the goal.
Yeah. So that's true. Usually we will be leading up to some kind of climactic large battle at the very end. How about the settings?
I'll let someone else answer.
Sure.
At least in these examples, it seems to be that they're in this old setting, a little more not modern day, like usually in the past.
Yeah, that's true a lot of the time, because these, when we're referring to classic pulp, it was written in the past. So for them, it was modern day. But in terms of, so you're right, but you are right. When people do modern pulp, when they're trying to harken back to those older stories, a lot of the time they will set them in the past to kind of make it feel more like those original stories. You can do modern pulp though. Or how about just the locations the characters go to though? That's when we look at setting, we're like, where is the adventure taking place?
Oh yeah, usually in a different country or a different place where it's like globetrotting.
Yeah, globetrotting. So we're going to not just anywhere though, right? We're not just going to some back alley in England. We're going to exotic locations. We're going to far off reaches. What is this? The Conqueror of Mars? We're going to Mars. We're going to a place where there's aliens that have swords and clubs. We're taking boat trips to the far reaches of the Pacific. We're going to distant, dangerous locations with this element of mystery and excitement. So after the 50s, people did start looking back to the pulp era more nostalgically, and when they did, they usually locked onto these more over-the-top stories of these proto-superhero characters like the Shadow or the Phantom. Many people point to Raiders of the Lost Ark. I think we all know Indiana Jones and the sequels, which took these 1930s pulp adventures as their main inspiration, and that was kind of the keystone of this pulp resurgence. So this term two-fisted tales refers to stories told in the style that reflect fondly on these old pulp stories. So that usually means, as was just mentioned, that these will be set in the 20s or 30s and focus on these square-jawed, clever men and women of action. And how about in terms of character competence? We were talking about action heroes start competent and stay competent. Pulp characters are competent in ways that we can't even, that are almost ridiculous to look back at. Like, let's think of Batman. What are Batman's skill sets? What can Batman do?
He's rich and he has lots of utilities that he's able to use. I mean, I forget which Batman movie it was, but one person asked, one superhero asked, so what are your what are your abilities? And he says, I'm rich. Right. And because he's a billionaire, I know he starts off as a millionaire originally, but because now he's a billionaire, he has all these gadgets, that he can, I think he calls them utilities, but they're gadgets that he can utilize to be a superhero, even though he's just this rich dude who happens to want to be a crime fighter, which, right. I mean, to me, that's really cool. I think that's one of the reasons why people love Batman so much, because he's just a guy. He happens to be rich, and he wants to fight crime, so he creates all these gadgets to do it. He's not Superman.
Right, but because he's rich, I mean, yes, you're right, he has a lot of gadgets, but that's only one of his many skill sets. What else can Batman do?
He's a detective. He's a superhero detective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's the world's greatest detective. Don't they call him that?
Yeah. Yes.
So he's not only rich, and because it's like, I think what he was saying in that moment, he was being kind of facetious. He was saying, because I am rich, I can do all these different things. Because he can afford all the best tutors, he can afford all the best inventors to help make him gadgets, like Lucius Fox or people like that. What else can Batman do? We haven't even touched on all the things that Batman can do.
He can sort of punch sharks like they're nothing in the 1960s one. He has like a utility for literally anything. It'll be like something Batman spray or something. It'll be like shark spray, or it'll be, his bat shark spray. Like at least that one is a bit more ridiculous and comedic. But yeah, he can basically have a gadget for anything, and in any situation, he'll either punch his way out or grapple hook away or do some gadget that he has.
Right. So we might say he has like super preparedness. He's super smart. He's not just rich. He's also like top level intelligence. He can outwit anyone. He's the world's greatest detective. And somebody mentioned you mentioned he can punch sharks, and somebody in the chat said he's a master of martial arts too. Do we forget he was trained by a clan of ninjas? Like, or at least in some versions of this. So we're like, your character isn't just in a lot of stories, your adventure stories, even your character is competent in one or two ways. But in pulp, they can be competent in basically everything. There's almost nothing that your character needs to have off limits to them. And the challenge in pulp comes in making that character feel really human, despite the fact that they are hyper competent. Or think of Indiana Jones. He's a similar sort of thing, right? He's a genius history professor and archaeologist. He teaches, high-level classes at school. He can also fight. He can also shoot. He's basically a soldier. He has almost unlimited endurance. He can speak like 12 languages. He's like the ultimate adventurer, right? He can do everything.
Are they kind of
go ahead.
Mary Sue's? Are they kind of Mary Sue's? Because what I've been told of Mary Sue is that they're a person who can do everything, but they didn't have to work at it. Where, Batman was trained by ninjas. Indiana Jones is a genius, raised by a genius. He's hyper focused on what he can, his field. Everything belongs in a museum. And I think that he actually was in combat. Like, he had been in World War II, despite the fact that he's in the Nazi era, that he had fought for or been in World War I or something like that.
Maybe, I can't remember, but in any case, to answer your question of are they Mary Sue's, the answer a lot of the time is, in our modern definition, yes, 100%. But people really only use that term when they don't like the character. That's the difference. Is that you can have a character that can do everything and can be super good at literally every skill, but the audience is only really going to react super negatively when it seems like that character is too blatantly a wish fulfillment character for insert of the author. Like, a lot of the time when the character feels like a version of who the author wishes they were, sometimes we'll say that's like a Mary Sue, like a self-insert character. Or it might just be a character that just seems good at everything for no reason. And a character that has no rationale behind why they can do everything right off the bat, and everyone immediately respects and likes them, and everyone wants to fall in love with them, or everyone wants them to, everyone gives everything to them without them having earned it. Will sometimes earn that title from people. But ultimately, if we look back at Batman, of course he's a Mary Sue. Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I don't think that term means very much. It's really just something that people are going to throw around when they don't like how you have portrayed that character.
But to keep them from being Mary Sue's and to make them a little bit relatable, don't they need a few flaws? Like Indiana Jones, he hates snakes. And he always says, why does it have to be snakes?
Sure.
It gets a bit of snakes. Or, or other things, and Batman, I don't know what he hates except like crime fighters, but he's always he's eternally dealing with his parents' murder.
That's true.
And Alfred is his best friend and kind of surrogate father.
Yeah, he can't really make connections with other people very well, is sort of Batman's flaw, I would say. He's very distant and very reserved. And you said his best friend is his butler, so yeah, there you go. That kind of shows that he can't make friendships like anyone else can. And yeah, introducing those flaws is really going to help combat that feeling of the character being a Mary Sue. But ultimately, the term I wouldn't worry too much about it. Especially in adventure, where we kind of just really like this kind of character. So, in terms of pulp attitudes and the way that pulp stories were told, classic pulp ran on these basic principles of action, science, and optimism. So the difference between pulp and noir is that noir is super cynical, whereas, pulp is super optimistic. And I've drawn this from the Fred Hicks role-playing game called Spirit of the Century, but he talks about optimism as sort of the most potent of these three principles, and it's not this kind of shallow, sunny disposition that we so often equate with optimism. It's this feeling, if we look back at the era that these stories were coming out, the 1920s was a time after World War I where technology started to make it seem like anything was possible. Like, one day we were, just in 10 years, we went from flying is impossible to we're using planes in warfare. We just came out with things like radio and transatlantic cables. We can go all around the entire world in just such a short time. We have cars. We've gone from horses to cars in just such, like, a decade that it's starting to jog in people's minds this idea that things could be better and things could be different. And through things like science and through knowledge and just the application of that stalwart American human spirit, then we can make a difference and we can improve things. And taking action can change things. And even if you don't change things for the better, maybe you will inspire other people to do the same. Choosing not to act is a bad thing in pulp because it's like sticking your head in the sand and hoping for the best. It's really looking at the world from this point of view of the world can and should be a better place, and your characters are trying to accomplish that. When we go, and there is the crossover between pulp and noir as well, and noir is very characterized by the opposite of these things, and noir is all about, I am one man in this corrupt and broken city, and I am the only one who can possibly hold off the darkness for another day. I'm the only one that can stop the evil forces from taking over for one more day, and I might die, and that's it. And it's just this very sort of like more Great Depression era mindset that differs a lot from this classic pulp approach of optimism and hope. Let's look at quests. So an adventure character needs a pretty simple overall goal. And who knows what a MacGuffin is?
A distraction, I think. Like the thing that you thought you were the thing you thought was the goal isn't, kind of, I feel like.
That's a red herring.
I think it's basically the goal of what they're getting. So, like, example, if their quest is to find the Holy Grail, the MacGuffin will be the Holy Grail because that's what's driving the story, or like sets them in motion to find it. In Indiana Jones would be the Ark of the Covenant, or in the first one at least, I think, which would be he's searching for it, and then that's why all the Nazis come in because they also want him. Then he has to fight the Nazis. It's the catalyst for starting the reason for the adventure.
Yeah, it's a way of simplifying the goal of the adventure. If we say something like, the goal is to stop the Dark Lord, the MacGuffin might be, you need to get this ring. Because that ring, if you get that ring and steal it and destroy it, it will represent you defeating that Dark Lord. It's usually an object, and classically in like old-fashioned Hollywood terms, it's like a briefcase full of money. I think we've seen this MacGuffin used like 10 trillion times. Or it's it's a necklace, or it's a magic thing that the characters are going after. And it's just a way to really nicely organize a quest. And a MacGuffin might be something like a place, or sometimes it's a person, like in The Fifth Element. You see, hopefully you see what I mean. That the MacGuffin is that you don't need to have a MacGuffin, but it's just a nice way of organizing the objectives for a story. So in terms of objectives, it's nice to have this very clear overall tangible goalpost. Defeat Sauron by throwing this ring into this volcano. But that's going to be broken up into many, many sub-objectives. Overall, that bigger quest, that umbrella quest, should have that sense of clear goalpost, high stakes, so big consequences for failure. It should be difficult, so with strong opposition. It needs to be urgent, so a sense of ticking clocks. And it should just be fun for us, the audience. It doesn't have to be fun for the characters that are going on it. In fact, usually it won't be fun for them at all. But it's fun for us to watch because we're going to watch competent characters, or characters that are becoming competent, overcoming physical, dangerous obstacles in various interesting ways that are pertinent to their skill sets. So we're asking, how would just your hero be the one to succeed at this? And one of the most fun things of these different quests, or one of the most fun parts of adventure writing, is breaking up different groups of characters to face obstacles of different scales that are most difficult for just that group. So let's think of, for instance, Return of the King. We've broken up the group into 3 different main sections. We have Frodo and Sam together, right, and Gollum, and they're going to Mordor. In the meantime, we have the Fellowship, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn. And then sometimes we go to Gandalf and Pippin in the 3rd movie as well. And we also go to Merry and Éowyn as our 4th sort of POV group, which includes Theoden also. And with them and Faramir. And we have like all these different divisions of characters that are each facing different obstacles at the same time. Sometimes we're even intercutting directly between 2 different battles going on. But you need to match those battles to those characters. For instance, Shelob, remember the giant spider from the mountain passes that Sam and Frodo and Gollum end up running into, would not be that big a challenge for Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli. They're like superheroes. They can kill 100 orcs like it's almost nothing. They're not really ever in physical danger. So their quests are not really going to... The question isn't going to be, can they defeat this opponent? What are Legolas, Aragorn, and Gimli doing in the meantime? They have to go to the the crypt of the army of the dead, and they need to convince that army to join their side. So their quest is not the thing. Remember how we're trying to always match the character to the most difficult or impactful thing for that group of characters to do? You gotta scale those different conflicts to those different groups of people so that we're not always able to just very easily blaze through the different obstacles. And it provides this really nice sense of verisimilitude to the world if one character is facing something that would not at all be a challenge to one of the other ones, or we're challenging them in different ways that are directly straining their skill sets in directions that they would have not expected. So the dumb character is forced to solve the puzzle, or we have, the smart character is forced to fight in the arena, and we now need to see, okay, how would a smart character win a fight in the arena? They're not gonna be able to stab the other guy. They have to throw a knife and have it bounce off the wall at the right trajectory to cut the rope to knock down the big crate. You see what I mean? So we have to watch your different characters strain to succeed in different ways based on how you split them up and based on the obstacle that you've put that group up against. Any questions about that premise?
Okay, so I guess I am a little bit not confused, but I guess I want a tiny bit more of clarification, like on clear goalpost, and ticking time. I know that when I write the log lines, I think I'm doing really well, and then you often ask me, well, what's the ticking clock in here? And I have to think about it, and also, being a novelist, I tend to write my log lines kind of like back pages of novels, unfortunately. But a little bit more clarification on a clear goalpost. Do you does it have to be at the end, or can you have multiple goalposts to the very end, at the very end?
You can have, so for sure you have an overall goal, and we have sequential goals that lead up to that bigger one. Your overall goal might be something as simple as just survive. And then in order to do that, in a defense type story, then the first obstacle might be a wave of goblins is attacking our castle. The second quest is a wave of hobgoblins is attacking our castle. And the third one is a wave of trolls with catapults is attacking our castle. And to that end, all of that was still just to achieve the tangible goalpost of survive, keep the castle standing. But each sub-objective along the way has a really clear end-finish line to it. How do we know when we've succeeded at the goblin attack? Well, the goblins are dead and we're still alive, right? So that is what I mean by you got to have the overall goal and the smaller goals that lead up to it. But I think we have to have an overall goal, even if it's as simple as survive or get to a different location or something like that. If you don't have an overall goal, then it's not really a long-form narrative. It's more a series of episodes. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. That makes sense.
So that's the difference between... That's okay. That's the difference between episodic storytelling, and you can write episodic stories too. That's okay as well. Something like The Witcher starts out very episodic, and it's more just like a series of mini self-contained adventures. But even within those, there's going to be the overall goal and the objectives you have to accomplish to do that. So it might be even on a small-scale adventure, your overall goal might be kill the witch that's been haunting this farm. And your first goal might be, okay, we have to find the witch, meaning we're going to have to track her through the woods. Second goal, we have to find a way to get into her castle. Third goal is we can always split up your larger goal into these subsections that require their own tactics to overcome. Let's look at escalation a little bit. So typically, through these quests, the danger and stakes should be increasing steadily. The ticking clock, which I mentioned, I can go over ticking clocks a little bit more too. That ticking clock is going to be adding urgency and danger throughout. In Lord of the Rings, we have a lot of ticking clocks. The most key essential 3 ticking clocks to begin with are 1, the ring wraiths are getting closer to finding the ring, and the closer they get, the more trouble we're in, because if they get it, it's all over. 2, the ring is corrupting Frodo, and the longer that he has it, the higher chance either that he goes crazy and turns evil, or that the enemy finds him because they're able to see it every time he puts it on. And our third major ticking clock is Sauron's armies are ravaging all of Middle-earth and threatening to destroy the last strongholds of man. So even if Sauron doesn't get the ring, if we don't succeed in destroying it fast enough, he will still win. So do you see how each of those separate 3 things is adding its own sense of impending pressure and doom and urgency? And if your characters stop even for a second, then they will be in way bigger trouble, because every one of those ticking clocks will have advanced further along its timeline and brought those consequences closer to bear. So, comedy is something that you can use to lessen the sense of danger a little bit, but only kind of strategically. We shouldn't make it seem like that the protagonist, of course, is going to win. Like, that's rarely going to be a joke. If it seems like there's no danger anymore, then it will start to seem like the main character is always going to win. So, in most cases, it should seem like your hero is up against overwhelming forces that he's not guaranteed to win, even if we know it's the stories and we know the conventions of the genre, so we know they ultimately pretty much are. But still, it shouldn't seem like they are, and we shouldn't use too much humor to lose the seriousness of the quest that your character is on. Action heroes are always competent or become competent, but they have to be pushed to the edge of that competence. The deck is stacked against them, but they have to fight for every inch of ground. Even if they always win, some reveal or complication after each encounter should set up some new stakes or set up some new ticking clock or push us in some sort of new direction. So think something like Superman or James Bond. It's like, are we ever really going to run into a fight where they don't win? Not really, unless they get captured or something, which happens all the time. But in any case, they're usually going to win. And then once they win, they're going to be like, I got the bad guy. And the bad guy reveals in his last seconds of life, he's like, I planted 5 bombs all around the city. And we're like, oh no, now I have to rush to the next objective, which was just set up and is even more urgent and is even more difficult. And just the fact that I've succeeded early on hasn't made my journey difficult. It's made it harder, or it has unlocked that next kind of objective.
I have 2 questions. Okay, about the use of humor, like in Indiana Jones, which is, it's just my favorite action series. Indy uses humor, and it's great. It helps break up things, and but it doesn't lessen the fact that he's got to fight the Nazis.
Yeah.
But it's great. Like, when he shoots, when the guy's got the swords and he's twirling them, and he just pulls out a revolver and shoots him, and the guy drops dead. I mean, or at least he's injured, or when in one of them where he's fighting this really big bad guy, and the plane is starting to go, and then the guy gets killed by the blades, and what's kind of funny is beforehand, where the plane's kind of out of control, or where his father shoots down the thing that controls, I forget, or in James Bond, where one of them, where he actually dies, but he's not dead. He's just, it's part of the plot, where the bad guy needs to think he's dead.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of humor, I guess you're asking how do you balance it and make sure the humor isn't reducing the danger? Is that what your question is?
That I think I know, but I'm thinking you said where the bad guy can't lose. Well, in James Bond, like in Skyfall, or no, that's not Skyfall. One of them, he's declared dead, but he's not actually dead, and it's
that does happen in Skyfall. And then you only live twice. Well, it happens in a couple of them.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the plot device, or one situation where he's naked and the guy's like, hitting him in the testicles and electrocuting him. You think, or at least I thought, he's gonna die, and you're right. The last one he does die, but he's gonna be bad. And okay, I'll stop.
So sorry, what was the question, or did you answer it yourself?
No. I just said okay, I'll stop.
Oh, okay. Any other questions on escalation in action adventure?
What happens, and this happens, I see this sometimes, where like to like the smaller threats are too big, so that by the time they get to the big threat, it feels like they've already defeated like 7 million versions of the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a specific example of this?
I don't know. This happens a lot in like movies where like there's like an endless amount of henchmen, and then the final guy is just another henchman, basically. Like there's nothing that distinguishes him. And I don't know if I have like an example of like this, but like I know like their power keeps increasing or whatever, and they keep getting better, but then like everything just becomes, I don't know how to say it exactly, but I see it sometimes.
I see what you're saying. There's no final boss, that kind of story.
Well, not necessarily. Like I don't know. Like it feels like I guess you could say that, but it feels like the final threat is not as impactful because everything they've gone on in their journey is more impactful. If that makes sense.
In those stories, and we're talking about things like Saving Private Ryan, I think in this case, which is a war adventure type story.
Yeah, I guess.
This is one where they're having battles all throughout. There's nothing to really. Well, there actually are sometimes sort of mini bosses that make these sections feel more impactful. Like the sniper in the tower is sort of like a mini boss, or we might say, like you can elevate even Mook characters to that level of mini boss to add more importance to those sequences. I think that when you're doing that type of story, though, where we're not leading up to beating some kind of big bad guy, like we're not trying to fight Hitler in Saving Private Ryan, what you should focus on in terms of escalation is the cost on your characters. So look at who are we losing, who is getting hurt, what is the psychological cost on them, and that is going to be more of the escalation than we're fighting tougher and tougher and tougher bad guys. So yeah, I think a lot of war stories work like this. So the escalation is more in terms of the attrition on your main cast of characters and on the psychological toll that it's taking on them.
Right. It's a lot of times it could be like the journey itself is the villain because they have to be on this journey, and the more they go on it, it's how it affects them personally, and that's the challenge is like how to stay sane while going on this journey.
Mm-hmm. And even within that, we can still have sort of climax, like big set pieces that do act as it could still feel like 1917 is a good example where like it's sort of just episodic challenge after episodic challenge throughout most of the movie, but there is still a climax. He still does need to run the trench at the end and like do the sort of biggest, most difficult, dangerous thing of all, even though it's not like he doesn't have to fight the final boss or anything, but it's still something that is a bit more challenging than it's like it tops everything that comes before it to some extent. But yeah, focus on the effect on the main characters in that and the toll that the journey's taking on them.
Call it the boss. I mean, it seems like it's the bad guy, but why are you calling it the boss?
We might say the boss would be like the overarching villain, the most powerful villain. I'm using kind of video game terms to calling them the boss, but usually this is going to be the character that is in charge of all the other bad guys, like your Dark Lord or your general of the army, or the biggest worst guy, your Darth Vader, as opposed to your Stormtrooper.
Okay, but that changes though when we see the Emperor later on. So okay.
So in the first Star Wars movie, the sort of final boss is Darth Vader, but yeah, you're right. In the later ones, the scope does expand, so we realize, that boss was subservient to another boss, which is something we do in these series a lot.
And in that case, when we see that Darth Vader suffered, and we find out that he's Luke Skywalker's dad, and we realize that he's subservient to a much more evil or powerful boss. Maybe not less more evil, but more powerful. And we begin to develop a little bit of sympathy.
Yeah, Darth Vader is a tragic villain for sure.
Right. Yeah, it's a tragic villain. He turns to the dark side to save his wife and baby, and then ends up losing them because she doesn't want him anymore, because of what he's doing. But okay, I just wanted to know about how do you describe the boss and the sub boss, or the overall bad guy and the sub bad guy? How do you describe them when you're writing?
How do you describe them?
I mean, define them.
Define them.
If you're writing and you're trying to sell your work, and you how do you define them? How do you describe them to that person?
So the sort of final overall boss is usually the one we're working throughout the entire series, or the entire book at least, to defeat. And we're not going to defeat them before the end. That's just how the genre works. If you defeat your villain before the end, then usually they weren't the villain, or there's a bigger one in the shadows that we didn't know about. So think like Darth Maul we defeat in the first movie, but who was Darth Maul working for? And that's always going to be that's usually going to be a question that leads us to a sequel is, well, that was only one piece of a larger sort of, conspiracy or faction or something like that. So your overall boss is the one that usually will take the entire series to defeat. Whereas your sub-bosses are going to be for maybe just the big bad guy of that book or of that chapter of that book. And that's how I break it up. So let's look at different types of objectives and the different sorts of things that your character will be doing in quests. Let me maybe actually pause and look at questions from the chat really quick. Are there any questions I've missed? Maybe not. Oh, maybe not. Okay. So our main quest is going to be broken up into these sub-chapters that are going to each have a different type of goal associated with them. Usually in action-adventure stories, we can consider those to be attack, defend, or move. Offense, defense, or traveling from one place to another. And sometimes the story will change from one to the other over time. Look at something like Wraiths of the Broken Land by S. Craig Zahler that starts as a move story where basically it's a really dark Western adventure about some ladies get kidnapped by some really evil bandits. Some good guys go and hire a guide. Our main character is going to be the guide to take them through the Badlands to find the bandits, and he kind of gets roped into their quest. And then when they get there, they have to now attack the bandits and get the women back. Then, as they're escaping, the bandits launch a counterattack, and the final act of that book is our characters set up like a fortress and now need to defend themselves. So we transition from move to attack to defend. There's sort of three main thrusts of that quest. Lots of stories will have an overall sort of feeling to the quest, like Lord of the Rings, Frodo's ultimate goal is move. He just needs to get from one place to the next. He's not trying to defeat anybody. I mean, throwing the ring in the volcano will achieve that goal of defeating the evil faction. But he can run away from any fight he needs to. He's not trying to, like, his ultimate goal is as simple as get from here to there and throw a thing into a hole. And then within that, like, we have these lots of subsections, like defending Weathertop, for instance, at which point or defending Helm's Deep. I know Frodo is not involved in Helm's Deep, but you see what I mean, that, like, we can break up this quest into many, many, many little pieces. Let's look at, and this is called a travelogue style story if it revolves around going from one interesting place to another interesting place, and in each place there will be some different challenge there. So let's look at the first few objectives. Our overall goal is throw the ring into the volcano. Objective 1, get to Bree, a nearby city to the Shire. The obstacle, there are ring wraiths that are after our characters. So Frodo has to avoid being caught by these murder ghosts on his way to this city. Now, once they're in Bree, they have to get to Rivendell. The obstacles are, the wraiths are getting closer, of course, and Frodo gets this terrible injury from the ring wraith blade on the top of, on Weathertop. And as a result, he's now dying unless he gets to Rivendell fast enough, and he gets the special elvish medicine that Arwen tells us about, and now that's our new sub-objective. Next, from Rivendell, we have to cross the Misty Mountains, which is essentially failed, and it's a great twist to throw in the middle of these sometimes if you just simply fail an objective. But the complication as a result of that, the kind of, we can choose, does your character succeed at a quest? We can say, yes, but, using this principle of they do succeed but at a cost, or we can use this principle of no, and. So we say, do they cross the mountains? No, and they're forced to instead go through the mines. So we're going to go through the mines of Moria. Our next sub-objective is get into the mines. We have to get through this puzzle door, and in the meantime fight this giant octopus called the Watcher that lives right outside. Once we get into the mines, now we need to get through them to the other side. So I'm not going to do the whole story, but you can see what I mean, that you can break each section up into these really simple, really achievable goals that have a clear obstacle standing in the way. And you might have to imagine as they get more difficult, because they should be getting more difficult, your main character is going to be pushed more and more and more along some kind of track of development. And what we mean by that might be they're getting more competent over the course of the story. What else? How else might your hero be changing over the course of the story?
Maybe they, like, if they have like magic or something, maybe they have to learn to control it better over the course of their time, or maybe their courage is changing. They're growing stronger with whatever they're doing, and they become more skilled in whatever field they're in.
Sure. So yeah, I think most of that would fall under competence, but you mentioned magic. So in terms of the powers that the character has, those themselves might be changing. The powers themselves might be changing, right? So in something like we look at a story about a character learning magic, as they become more competent, it could be that their magic actually becomes more unstable or becomes more dangerous, or maybe they go from having conjuration powers to having divination powers by the end. Or maybe they're losing powers and gaining some others. So yeah, the powers that the character has access to might be changing. What else? What other ways is the hero developing over these many different obstacles in an adventure story?
I mean, it could be if they have a crew of people they're with, maybe their relationship with the people.
Relationships, great. That's another big track that we're moving the character along. Mm-hmm. It's either getting... Usually we can break this down to as simple as getting closer to or further away from someone else in their group. They're becoming friends or they're becoming enemies with the people that they travel with. What else? What are some other ways your hero is developing along the course of these various quests? Competence, magic, relationships? Amanda wrote a fantasy book.
Sorry, what were you gonna? So, what was the question?
So the hero's changing in many ways through these different obstacles, like Lucy in your book, right? So they might be changing in terms of competence, becoming more competent. They're maybe getting more powers, or their powers are changing, and their relationships are changing with the people they're with. How else is the character changing?
So, do you want me to use my example?
If you want, but yeah, I just wanted to call on somebody. Go ahead.
Yeah. That's a good exercise for me, anyways. So she's a scaredy cat who's never really been outside the castle. So she's learning how to deal with like dirty, gross underworld stuff. Mm-hmm. So just basic competence and kind of courage to get past, traditional, her kind of sheltered life.
So let's look at, so her outlook is changing, is what you're saying.
Her outlook is changing. Some level of skill or like, I guess outlook is a better word. Outlook, and then her outlook on her own kingdom changes as she learns about how corrupt it is, and she saw things as sort of black and white. My kingdom's good, yours, everybody else is not, and so very kind of classic coming of age story of seeing that your own home or your own country isn't like just totally good.
Great, yeah. So her outlook and her opinions are changing as she learns more about the world. I think there's one more thing that I'm waiting to hear from someone. Is there anything else that's changing?
Well, like you're talking about relationships?
We did relationships. That's almost always the first one that I will go to, and you're correct for choosing that, definitely. But the last one that I want to focus on is emotionality. So how is your character changing emotionally?
Okay, what's an example of that? Because I guess, I'm curious how you would describe that.
Your character might start the story being a total scaredy cat, and they might toughen up over the course of the story.
That's part of it. Okay, that's what I meant more than outlook initially.
Oh, okay.
She's kind of toughening up. Yeah.
That might be one way. Or maybe the journey they're going on is really breaking them down, and they're getting depressed. They're getting sadder and sadder. Every single quest they have to accomplish, they lose something important to them. And that's breaking them down over time. Like, character and emotion should be the first things that we look at when we're talking about how is the character changing. And everything else can come from that. Like, everything from their powers, which are sometimes directly linked to their emotionality in some way, right? To, like, no matter what it is, it almost all comes down to this root of character and emotion. So the things that your character sees or notices or learns about the world might be affecting them internally. And we have to look at, how is your character changing as a person as the story goes on? Are they becoming more forgiving or less forgiving? Are they becoming more tolerant or less? Are they becoming angrier? Is this starting to build a psychological toll on them where at some point they're going to snap? And I think we see that in a lot of characters. Remember when Frodo snaps at Sam? Isn't that so sad and heartbreaking? Where he's like, no, Sam, it's you. You're the problem. You have to go home. That's because that character has been pushed to the absolute limit emotionally. So really don't forget, character, relationship, and emotion are big parts of how these things develop. In terms of bookkeeping, I won't go way too into this just because we have so much to get into, but don't worry way too much about this stuff in your first draft. But especially in revision, it is your ultimate responsibility to maintain these consistent physics and rules to your world. So don't think of this as extra homework. Think of this as extra little grounding elements that can act as gateways to creative fun, and as clever ways to highlight the resourcefulness of your characters. Disadvantage is really key, and limitations are going to force more creativity. So think, like, what fun could we have when your character runs out of ammo for their weapons?
And when you are demonstrating these things, should this be through dialogue and action, or because what I've learned about writing novels is that you shouldn't have too much exposition. You should just mostly have your exposition through dialogue, where where the reader learns about your character through dialogue and action. So you don't have, like, when I was first writing my first novel, I had pages of exposition, and then I learned, no, you should make all this exposition, this dialogue that that the reader discovers about your characters through their, through talking to other characters, and maybe some action.
You can build these things through any number of different techniques. You can clarify, especially in a book, you have this opportunity to explore the character's thoughts and be in their mind. So, like I mentioned, that we can think of how much energy they have, or they're getting exhausted. Our character can just let us know, especially if it's a first-person book. It's like, I was getting exhausted as I climbed another hill to fight another goblin, whatever it is. Like, we're in your character's heads, so they can clarify what they're feeling for us very well in terms of energy and injuries. Also, emotional stakes. That kind of internal dialogue is going to be really essential for reminding us what matters to the character and why they're doing this, and they might flash back to thinking of their family at home as they are fighting Nazis, right? Because they're like, that's why I have to get home. So we can use any of these things. You might use dialogue to clarify emotional stakes. You might use this internal thoughts of your characters to emphasize their limitations of energy or injuries. In terms of just like watching action unfold, we can get a sense of how much ammo they have. We might see, a click comes from their gun when we run out of ammo. So we see, okay, they're out of bullets, and now they need to switch to martial arts.
Okay, or can they do like in a lot of action movies where they say, one bullet left, make it count?
You can do that.
I don't, although I say, that's a little cliche, you could say one, only one bullet left, what are we gonna do? Or no bullets left, and they throw the gun at the bad guy, maybe it hits him in the head, knocks him out. Anyway, but, can you say this instead of just think it, or which is better?
There's no better. There's different ways of, depending on the scene that we're in and the way that your book works and the point of view that we're taking, any of these things might work.
Okay. So, like, if the person is not terribly talkative and they tend to be more introverted and more in their head, it might be they're thinking this.
Yeah, that's fine.
Saying it. Okay, thanks.
In books, that works very well. You don't always have to have everything come out in dialogue. If you're writing an omniscient book, meaning it's from the point of view of a narrator that knows everything and can tell us anything at any time, then we can get into any character's heads, and we can tell us what anyone is thinking or feeling. So there's all kinds of ways to highlight and emphasize these action elements in novel writing. Let's look at villains. So there's kind of these three tiers of villain. I think we were talking earlier about the big bad versus the smaller bad. The sort of three tiers are going to be your arch villain at the top, your lieutenants or your henchmen in the middle, and then your faceless hordes at the bottom. And the ultimate villain is often going to personify the kind of anti-theme. I mean, that's why we have so often in these action adventure stories there will be this monologue where they're like, "You're not so different, you and I, Mr. Bond," because they are cut from the same cloth, or they are both trying to accomplish the same goal but in different ways. Is a really nice way of looking at this. In any case, we've chosen that villain to directly have some kind of philosophical conflict with your hero, that this battle between them is going to represent the victory of one ideology over the other sort of ideology. So by our hero defeating the bad guy, when the bad guy is always saying, people are fundamentally bad, and your hero's like, no, people are fundamentally good, then it's us sort of saying that one philosophy wins and the other one loses. Henchmen, these middle tier guys that work for your big bad, they thrive on this element of mystery and this unique style to them, and each one will require this kind of special tactic to defeat on their own. They might have some huge advantage that other characters, the smaller, villains don't have access to. We have Jaws, for instance, from the James Bond series. I don't think he's actually in the books, but he's in the movies. And he is like 8 feet tall, super strong, and has teeth that are made of metal and seem to be able to bite through literally anything. So those are both his advantages, and also they're going to give us these unique tactics that we have to use to defeat him. He has metal teeth. Oh, so we can electrocute him. Or, he is super tall, so we can knock him down with, he's easier to knock off balance and to push over. Something like that. Each of these henchmen will require their own unique tactic to overcome that are usually going to kind of match with your hero's development. And so as your hero becomes more competent, they will eventually gain the tools they need to overcome these sub-bosses. These lower level guys, these minions, not the actual DreamWorks minions, but these whatever we call them, the faceless minions, covering their, I mentioned this in terms of movies, but covering their faces or obscuring their identities, I would just say in terms of books, does lead to a very impersonal and sanitized and video gamey feel to these villains, which sometimes can work and sometimes can be okay, especially in pulp. We mentioned pulp is about fun, right? Like fun violence, and in pulp, violence is pretty much the answer most of the time. So to that end, we can't really humanize any of the villains way too much, or if we do, it has to just be in revelation of how evil they really are, because if it turns out that some of them are kind of good, or maybe there's ambiguity to what we're doing, then it becomes a little less easy to enjoy, which I think is actually why George Lucas switched from human enemies to more droid and clone-based enemies from the original trilogy to the prequels, is that violence is a little easier to keep more fun if we're killing opponents that aren't as human as we are. So, pairing the hero and the villain in terms of their philosophy is a really smart move. I mentioned that we want, if for instance, the hero and villain come from the same, they're cut from the same cloth in whatever way. Here we have both Magneto and Professor X. So the difference between, these guys both are mutants. That means they're people with this rare genetic thing that gives you superpowers that do something random, basically. We don't need to overthink the logic of X-Men and why some people have this gene that lets them shoot ice and some people have a gene and it lets them fly. And there's also the Juggernaut who got his powers from a magic ruby, but we just don't talk about it. So don't worry about the actual logic behind the X-Men right now. But if we think of the hero and villain in terms of their clash of philosophy, some of the strongest pair-ups are going to be two characters that are both trying to accomplish the same thing, or I often say they either come from the same background or from opposite backgrounds. So either they're both rich, or one is rich and one is poor, or they're both poor. Could be an example of how you would do that. So in our case, we have two heroes. They're both mutants, and they both are trying to ensure that mutants can live and exist in the world without being oppressed and, arrested or killed by all, or feared and hated by all the humans, right? But they have very different ways of going about this. Whereas Magneto feels that there is that there's a war that has already started, basically, and that mutants are under attack, and we need to destroy the humans in order to save mutant kind. And meanwhile, Professor X thinks, no, humans can live with mutants. We can all find a way to work together. But we see the problems and challenges that come with that, of course. And Magneto's point of view just makes so much sense, considering where he comes from. Does anyone remember what Magneto's backstory is?
It's from World War II, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he was in a concentration camp, right?
Yeah, right. So his parents were killed in the Holocaust. So he has seen firsthand the price of trying of discrimination and prejudice and rounding people up that are different than you and destroying them. He has seen the effect. He has the numbers tattooed on his arm. And so there is no clear, rationale for why he feels the way he does. And why he has been pushed to this extreme. Like, obviously he's going too far. We shouldn't kill every human, most people would say. But there's no arguing with where he's coming from. He's like, they will do to the mutants what happened to my parents as a kid. That's human nature. And the thing is, he's right. And again, we see examples where the villain being fundamentally right about something that's difficult to argue against makes a lot of action-adventure stories really, really work well. Does anyone else have any other examples of villains that you kind of rooted for or you kind of sympathize with?
I have one that it's interesting because they're not someone that you really sympathize with, but they at least have a perspective that you could understand. Mm-hmm. And that, I guess, would be Thanos from Marvel, because his idea is that in his mind he's making the right necessary sacrifice for the good of everything in the universe by killing half of it, which is something that if you think really negatively and like the glass half empty, like if you think there's only one way to do it, which is to sacrifice the many for the benefit of the whole, there is a justification in his mind that makes sense, and we as an audience can get that, but we ultimately know he is the villain and all that.
And I haven't actually seen any of the movies with him, but does he know it's wrong too? Like, he admits that it's an evil thing to do? Yeah,
he does. He believes it's good ultimately, but like in the end he eventually just straight up says, like, it becomes clear that he also knows it's like an evil thing to do. Right.
So that's a great place to come at a villain, or from that perspective, to approach writing a villain from that perspective of, they may know what they're doing is wrong, but they don't care because they think that it's important enough that they have to be the one to do it. And that just is hard to, like, it's great if you can write a big bad villain that has something they're fundamentally correct about, and that's hard to argue against, because the fact that your heroes then have to find a way to refute that philosophy makes them have to build so much of a stronger case for their side. So in that case, I haven't seen those, but your heroes would then have to be forced to say, okay, we know the universe is overpopulated or whatever, but humanity can solve that problem. We're good. We can fight that. And your villain can quite correctly say, no, you can't. So therefore, the only way to ultimately defeat them is through this action conflict that represents our philosophy defeating theirs.
What about Joker? I mean, in the movie, the Joker movie, you realize that he's insane. It's not just that he's a bad person. He actually has a psychiatric disorder, and he has a really hard life with his mom. Although I'd say he's probably not as sympathetic to her as he could be, but anyway, he still takes care of her, and he has a mental illness, and he has a very bad job. And although I don't know what kind of mental illness he has, probably maybe like some form of schizophrenia. Anyway, and it's not just that he's a sociopath; he is psychopathic because he has these lapses with reality, and so at least I felt sorry for him because, he couldn't get the help that he needed, and it's also very common for people with psychiatric illnesses to think that they don't need help. So I was really sympathetic to him.
But the movie Joker's not an action-adventure movie, though.
Oh, well, okay, but I'm sorry, you're just asking about people villains I felt a little bit for, so you're right.
Oh, sure. No, that's a good point. You're right. And so, yeah, Joker as a character is in some action-adventure stories, and he's in some other types of stories, too. Like Joker's a drama. And to that end, there is not a villain to pair him with in Joker. Or I guess it would be, I don't know, Murray? There's not really a villain in a traditional sense in the Joker movie, or it's a villain protagonist, we could say. But you're right, in that movie, more than any of the others, they do humanize him, and we come to understand where he's coming from, and I think that's what makes this so different from the action-adventure stories he's also in, where we learn basically nothing about him. And although he is crazy, he is, like, let's think of The Dark Knight, I guess, would be just another movie with the same character, where we see that he is crazy, but he's doing what he does mostly in opposition to Batman, because he's so obsessed with Batman and what Batman represents that he sort of adopts chaos as his philosophical standpoint or whatever. So he's like, this guy that I'm up against is a force of pure order and goodness, so I'm going to test him at every turn, and I'm going to see where I can break him and see where I can poke holes in his philosophy. So, yeah, Joker and Batman dynamic is really interesting, and the Joker movie does kind of break that, because it sort of says, okay, in a story without a villain, we're just going to dive as deep into this character as we can. But good to bring up that distinction. Let's keep going. We have only 10 minutes. I've got like a bunch more slides I could do. Let me just scroll through and see what I actually want to touch on. Could talk a little bit about fight scenes, use of henchmen, set pieces, A defeats, B defeats, C I probably do want to do. 5-man band we could talk about. Yeah, let me go to A defeats, B defeats, C, because this is kind of one of my favorite things, and also I haven't talked about this in too many classes. So, writing fight scenes in prose as opposed to writing fight or action scenes in movies. What is the difference? What are the big differences?
The inside the head of the characters and doing things that are not visual but more emotional.
Yes, excellent. So we're inside the head of the characters usually, and we can see why they're doing. We can see their thoughts and the justifications for why they're doing what they're doing. We can access their emotions. What else?
Question about this. When I have an action scene that I wrote in my romance, where the female uses her martial arts to save the man's life. He's kind of caught off guard, and he's not a martial arts expert like she is. She has multiple black belts, etc. And she saves his life from a guy who stabs him, pulls out a gun, etc. And but I've written it in prose, but not. She's not in her head. She's just reacting, and I'm curious how you would write an action scene with somebody also being in their head at the same time. I'm not sure how you do that.
Have you read books with action scenes in them? Most books with action scenes will have us be in the head of one of the characters involved, unless it's just people watching the action. Like if your characters are not part of the fight, then they could just be observing between two other parties. That could happen. But while we're in the characters' heads, we have to imagine they're going to feel the impact and the pain of every hit, right? So and you have to think that the language that you're going to be using has to kind of mirror their mental state. So you might, for instance, if there's a bunch of explosions going on all around them, you have to think, how are we going to now write this character's internal thought process? It might simplify a lot. They're not really going to be having complex, difficult thoughts while there's explosions going on all around them. Their thoughts are going to be like, find cover, hide, like explosions everywhere. I need to just hide. I need to not die. And then the explosions stop, and they're like, hey, the explosions have stopped. I just realized I've been shot. I'm bleeding profusely, and now I'm starting to feel the pain creep in. So you see how you can, like, since we're in the characters' heads, you can do all these things. You can, like, the fact that he had been shot would have been something we saw in a movie right away. But in a book, the fact that the character didn't even realize it until they were less panicky is a good way of taking advantage of being in that character's mind. Sorry, go ahead.
Do you write that person, like, John didn't know that he had been shot until he had a chance to look at his wound, or do you write like, "Ow, that hurt," John thought?
It depends. So it depends on your point of view and the way that you're writing the book. So books come in many different points of view. Like third person limited is one of the most common ones, in which we are saying, we are outside of the characters' heads, but you can dip into their thoughts whenever you choose. We have omniscient writing, where you can access any character's thoughts. That's actually very rare these days. And then we have first-person books where you are writing it from that character's voice. Like The Hunger Games is written from the perspective of Katniss. She is telling us what happens in the story. So you got to pick which one your book is going to be, and then you can take advantage of that in different ways in both action scenes and just all the time. So you got to decide and make those choices early on. There's not a better way to do it, but there's different things that you can emphasize depending on which method you pick.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So let's go over A defeats B defeats C just in our last minute here, because this is if I leave you with nothing else, maybe this will just be a fun technique you can use while writing action scenes specifically in prose. This does work in movies too, but it works really well in prose. So a fight is going to consist of these sub-obstacles or these sub-objectives, as we've talked about. And oftentimes that's going to break down to the different opponents in the fight. And it's going to add this really easy sense of progress to your fights. Obviously, we don't want to just have your character be punching people for 5 pages without any sense of how many of the bad guys are left to be punched, right? So we need to have a sense of how far in the fight we are. And that sense of progress and payoff is just really key to what makes storytelling work in general, but we see sort of a great mini version of that when it comes to fight scenes. So one of those very simple versions of progress in scenes is just we have 3 opponents and we need to take them all down. So this is sort of a simplification of how we write fights in stories, but I'm just going to go through this example here. Let's look at the 3 opponents that we have. So your character is going to fight a guy with a whip, a guy with a big spear, and a guy with heavy armor. And we might, in the beginning of the fight, we might have your character initially clash with each of these opponents and realize, oh no, they're all better than me. I'm going to need to be clever about this. And you want to be using fights largely as a series of problem-solving exercises to showcase your character's unique skill sets, tactics, and show them overcoming these challenges in interesting, various, visual and internal ways. So we have 3 opponents. Each has a weapon that is specialized in some way, and we might be able to think, if your character needs to solve this problem, a very fun and dynamic way to do it is going to be, we need to get the first thing to defeat the second guy, we need to get the second guy's thing to defeat the third guy. So first start off by asking, how would only your character get the whip from the first guy? So let's make our main character a clown. We were talking about the Joker. Let's make our main character a clown. Okay, so your clown is fighting these 3 bad guys. First, he does a whoopee cushion in the face, and then he grabs the whip from the first guy. That's a way that only a clown would solve that problem, right? So he throws confetti in the guy's eyes and does the whoopee cushion in the face. He takes the whip. We use the whip to get the spear. Now we use the spear to kill the guy with the heavy armor. So we've done A defeats B, defeats C, and we always start that off with something that only your character would do. And try to make each of the different, each of the different tactics they use very appropriate to the character. So maybe when he gets the whip, he turns it into a lasso first, like a crazy clown would do. He lassos the spear out of the guy's hands, and I don't know a way only a clown would kill a guy with a spear, but maybe he honks his nose, then he stabs the guy with the spear, whatever it is. So you can see how we've gained, with the victory from the first thing, we now have the tool we need to accomplish the next part. With the victory, or with the tool we gain from that part, we now are able to take down the next opponent. And you can do this, you can string this out for as many opponents as you want, but you generally, if you just really go into detail on 3 or so of these, then it's going to feel like a really complete and dynamic and complex fight scene. Of course, you want to mix it up sometimes and have maybe your character is about to defeat C and then suddenly they fail terribly at the last moment. We need to mix it up and make sure not every fight feels the same. Not every fight feels like get the whip to get the spear and get the spear to kill the guy in the armor. But this is just a ground level simplification of this principle that we can see how and we can replace these with anything, right? We might say your middle guy has the high ground, your last guy has a ray gun, your first guy has a Nerf bat, and we could do the same sort of thing where we might imagine a situation in which we need to get the Nerf bat to take the guy off the high ground because it's too far away for us to reach. We need the high ground before we can take out the guy with the ray gun because otherwise we don't have any cover from his ray gun shots. I just made that up. It's terrible, but I hope we can see that by putting these obstacles in your character's way and using them as challenges that your character will then have to overcome using their own skill set and their own ingenuity and creativity, it lends itself to writing these really active and dynamic and fun fight sequences on the page that are more interesting than just he kicked the guy with the whip, then he kicked the guy with the spear, then he kicked the guy with the armor. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes,
Yeah.
very cool.
I was just gonna
Yeah.
add, I don't know, this kind of applies to sort of using things in the environment as well, I guess, in a way, right? Like a person, the enemy B might be in some drawbridge or whatever, some place that the hero needs to conquer to get to the person C, right?
For sure. Yeah, this could be anything. This doesn't even have to be individual opponents. This could be 3 different countries that your general has to conquer, right? Or this could be 3 different cities that you have to conquer. It could be 3 different doors we have to get through. It could be almost anything. But just this model of fight writing just forces your character to use each victory and make that the key to getting to the next part of it. Any last questions on this?
You said that omniscient. I can't say the word. I know what it is. I know what it means. I can't say it.
Omniscient, yeah.
Omniscient. Oh, I can't say it. Anyway, that word. I just can't say it. Anyway, so you said those aren't very rare. Well, I know I write all of my novels. I write it with like, this person said, that person said, etc. Am I writing that kind of novel? Because I write all my novels that way. I don't write any first person novels, so I'm feeling like maybe I should change some to first person. So is that omniscient, or
no? So
something else?
So this person said, that person said. That means third person. So we're not in the head of a main central character. So omniscient means that we can access any information at all at any time. So your narrator might be, your voice of your narrator might be able to say something like, this character didn't know it yet, but he would die in 5 years. Or you might be able to say, that guy was thinking this, and that guy was thinking this. We're able to access any character's internal mind at any time. And we're able to access the past, present, and future. Your character is like a god in an omniscient story. Much more common nowadays is third-person limited. And limited means that you're following, just like, for instance, Harry Potter is third-person limited, right? We know what Harry Potter's thinking because we can access his thoughts anytime. We're not in his point of view. He's not saying, I did this or I did that, but we are outside. It's like we're outside of his body, but following him very closely. And we can't access anyone else's thoughts.
Okay. All right. That really helps. And I was thinking that it was third person, that, I had thought about maybe writing a few responses where this person thinks this person thinks that, and of course past tense, which I don't understand why third person novels are written that way, but anyway, so then does that then make it omniscient?
If you're telling us what multiple people are thinking in the same scene, then yes, that's omniscient, and that's called head hopping, and it's pretty rare and difficult to pull off. But you'd see it a lot in books from the 70s to the 90s. You would see it all the time, so it's not like it's impossible to do. But most books nowadays are written in limited point of view, where we're only accessing one character's thoughts at a time.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that, and
Sure.
I realize I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm just trying to get the most out of the class.
Yeah, no problem. We'll talk about that way more next weekend on our novel bootcamp intro class.
Okay.
So let's open the floor to, I realize I didn't get to every slide because I have so many slides in this presentation I couldn't even begin to. But let's open the floor to any questions on action and adventure writing that we've talked about today.
I'm curious for your thoughts on how to make action feel like it's not just happening to look cool, and more like how to make it feel more personal and not just every action is just there to look visually fun.
Great question. Here, I'm going to move this over to the side so you guys can look at what the upcoming WordCamp
I find
classes.
a lot of this happens often at times, I think, in like action movies, like like a Michael Bay movie or something, where sometimes he goes for the cool visual and loses the emotional weight of why it's happening, and just because it can happen and it would be cool to see. Sure.
So first thing is, books are not a visual medium, so we can't rely on stuff looking cool. So you're right, we do have to, if we want these action scenes to feel like they matter, then they need to have character stakes involved in them. So your main character should be fighting for a good reason, maybe just to survive. I mean, we get a lot out of your main character is just trying to survive. Obviously, you can't always have that be the only thing they're trying to do the entire book. But you want to make sure the objective matters to your character. So usually they should be fighting in an effort to accomplish their goal. Like, remember, we mentioned that overall quest goal. So we should be taking steps towards that goal in each action scene as best we can, or at the very least trying to not die so we can continue on that quest. So you need to make sure that quest is important enough and that your character has a vested interest in accomplishing that quest. So if we're trying to save the world, then every fight that we have along the way becomes pretty important. I mean, we can see why that device is so useful. It's because it makes everything hyper important. And any time that we are fighting people, it's to help us save the world, which your character, of course, would have a heavy investment in. But on a smaller level, I mean, saving the world is sort of hard to intellectualize for your characters, so we can add these smaller things, like, for instance, relationships and people that they care about that are involved in or threatened by these fights. And that's going to be one of the biggest things you can do. Relationships are the key to making this work. So having somebody else in the fight that your main character needs to protect, or that your main character is responsible for, or that your main character owes a huge favor to, or that is your character's best friend or their lover or their hated enemy. Any of these things is going to add that emotional investment. It's almost always going to come down to relationships. So your fights aren't going to feel meaningful unless we have people either in them that care about each other and are trying to protect and help each other, or we're fighting against people that we really hate and we really need to defeat, or maybe they're directly threatening our home village and people that we really love and that we need to defend. So, like, having something like that, if your character's only fighting for themselves again and again and again, it can work, but it doesn't feel always as immediate and as visceral as trying to fight in the service of some kind of relationship. Or at least we're watching characters fight together that, are working towards a very important common goal that they all have that emotional investment in. So it's going to come down to those things. One, having chosen an objective overall for your character that has high enough stakes in the first place, because if it doesn't, then you're not going to have enough fuel to make almost any of your action scenes feel like they matter. Two, you want to really have strong character relationships involved, and make sure you have characters that care about each other and care about other things in the world that these fights are directly threatening or pertinent to. And last, you want to make sure that we know who the people in the fights are and that we characterize everyone, including the opponents. I think that the movie The Quick and the Dead, which is a Western from 1995, which is one that I watched recently, I was really marveling at the way that it avoids this problem that a lot of Western action movies run into, where it's just like the middle of the movie has a bunch of gunfights where we're shooting at like 100 bad guys every time, and we don't know who any of them are, or we're not like that invested in what's happening. Do you know what I mean? Where a lot of Western and action and martial arts movies too will get to this point of we're just doing action scene after action scene where we fight a bunch of bad guys and then at the end maybe we move a little bit closer to our goal or something like that. But the first act of The Quick and the Dead does so much incredible work in introducing us to each of the people that will be involved in those fights later on, and we have an opinion on everyone. Whether there's that first guy that we meet, he's the grossest guy in the world. He's disgusting and rude and awful, and I really hope somebody beats him. The next guy we meet is kind of a tricky gambler. Like, we're not even sure what his motivations are, and we're trying to figure out what he's up to exactly. Like, and by the time that we get to this big string of crazy action sequences, we know who everyone involved is, we know what they want, and they feel human enough. I mean, it's a crazy cartoon Western type story, but they feel human enough within this context that we can understand what they're trying to do, what their personal stake in it is, and we understand that they're fighting for just as good a reason as your hero is. So having a bunch of mook villains just throw themselves into the meat grinder, wave after wave after wave of them for no reason, without any emotion from them or any investment from them, is just not going to feel realistic, and it's just going to start to lose us because we're not engaged in that fight in the same way. So there's my 3 tips for you. High stakes, character relationship, and by fleshing out all the people involved, we will come to care more about those fights. Great question. Last questions? All right, we'll finish for today then. Come to our upcoming free classes if you're not a member. If you are a member, then you will be able to continue with any of these boot camps, like for instance the novel boot camp, which starts next weekend. Write a whole book in 12 weeks, starting Saturday, February 25th, 12 to 2 on Saturdays for the next several months. I will be guiding you through writing the entire thing. So huge commitment, huge undertaking, but it is worth it. And I think we have some folks in the class that have taken that boot camp before. Amanda, anything you want to say or anything you would tell somebody who is considering taking or Aliska as well, feel free to weigh in. Any tips you have or recommendations you have or advice you have for folks maybe interested in taking the novel class?
let's see. Well, I wound up with very, very detailed, like I would say in between a first draft and scene cards at the end of it. And so I felt really good about that being my first draft. So I feel like the iteration of like the log line and then the outline and then the scene cards and then the draft is really important, because each stage is like a completed product in a sense, or a completed phase. And I really liked that approach. I don't know. That was my main thing. I wasn't sure if you decided to split it into 2 6 weeks or not. Did you decide to?
I think we're still thinking about that. I haven't fully discussed with Nacho yet. For this upcoming one, we might keep the same format, but I do like that idea. And maybe, depending on the arrangement of or how many students sign up, we might consider changing it up a little bit.
Yeah.
But still thinking about it.
So I would just say, even if, you're like, oh my God, I don't think I could actually spend the time to come up with 50,000 words for a novel in 12 weeks, I think it's still worth it if you do all the steps, and even if you do them a little slower. If getting a completed outline or completed scene cards is just a huge accomplishment, and just way a huge step. So
I agree.
I would say don't let the idea of like, oh, can I really write that much in 12 weeks? You can still get like you can get a light first draft if you just don't have the time to do all the writing, so.
Yeah, great point.
That would be my main.
We want to just get you on the path to finishing. Even if you don't finish the whole book, it's not like you failed and you have to drop out and you're going to be kicked out of ScriptCamp. It's nothing like that. I mean, we're trying to put you on that road to finishing and make sure that you are learning the skills that you can overcome these things on your own, and you can learn your own process to finishing your book. Thanks, Amanda.
I have something to add.
Go ahead.
I would really just kind of set the bar really high, because I think part of the reason why I was able to at least finish half of the book of 1,000 Years is because I set the bar really high for myself. And of course I got distracted, but if I really would have disciplined myself and kept to my word counts, I would have finished the entire book. So like, have high expectations of yourself, I think is what I'm trying to say.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, shoot for the moon, and even if you don't make it, you'll land in the stars or whatever. Isn't that some old inspirational poster quote or something like that? But yeah, if you aim for a lofty goal and you don't make it all the way there, you'll still have accomplished a lot and still learned a lot. Like, even if you don't, achieve everything that you set out to do, you'll still be learning and still be gaining experience.
That sounds like a good adventure story premise. They don't necessarily reach the goal, but they learned a lot along the way.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say, my point of view is that if you outline your novel completely, you've got your novel, and then everything else is filling in the blank. I know I have novels that I haven't finished filling in all the blanks, but they're completely outlined. And I work on those, and I think that probably most people can outline a novel in 12 weeks, and everything else, like I said, is just filling in the blanks. And so I just wanted to offer that. But I also wanted to say that while I can't afford $45 a month, I might be able to afford $19 a month, so I might join on that level. So, but it's just that for me, $45 a month is more than that I pay for my streaming. So, that's.
Understood.
I'm not saying it's not worth it. It's just that for me, it's a lot.
Totally understand, and thank you for weighing in. Yeah, I agree that when you writing that outline is so key to being able to complete the book. I'm an architect, you could say, really emphasizing this planning method where you get really organized at the beginning. So that's what the course is all about. Thanks for weighing in, everybody. We're going to call it now because we're a little over time, but we hope to see you soon at your next ScriptCamp class or event. For members, we have Writers Lab later today at 4 to 6, where you can come with questions about anything that you're working on. And then tomorrow we have Fantasy Group with Amanda at 5. Hope to see you guys soon. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Thank you.